This okay. Taking up for where we left off last week during the big storm that we had. So we were talking about throughout the apocalyptic literature, great use is made of animal figures of all kinds of symbolize men and nations. And the figure of the bull, for example, already familiar in the Old Testament as a symbol of God's presence and his power. And it also some of the things that we're going to look at, we're going to read in just a few moments, we find from First Enoch, the pseudographic uh, literature from chapters 85 and 86. They talk about the symbol of the patriarchs from Adam to that of Isaac. And in one passage, it represents the human Messiah and the members of his kingdom who became white bulls, just like Adam, first Enoch chapter 90. We're going to talk about those things. So down later, we have the quote down there from First Enoch, and it begins in verse 37. And he says there, then I saw the snow white cow was born with huge horns. All and horns actually was used for power. So the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky feared him and made petition to him all the time. I went on seeing until all their kindred were transformed and became snow white cows, and the first among them became something became a great beast with huge black horns on its head. The Lord of the sheep rejoiced over it and over all cows. Then chapter 89, verse 16 and 18, it says, then one sheep, which had been saved from the wolves, fled and escaped to the wild asses. But I saw the sheep continuing to lament and cry aloud, and they kept praying to their Lord. All their strength until the Lord of the sheep descended at their entreatment from a lofty palace, arriving to visit them. So the sheep then went to the wolves in accordance with the word of the Lord, together with another sheep which he had met. So the two of them went on and arrived together into the assembly of those wolves and spoke to them and warned them not to touch the sheep. Then in chapter 89, verse 45 and 18, verse 45 says, so the Lord of the sheep sent the sheep to another sheep and promoted him to become a ram and lead the sheep in place of that sheep which had abandoned his own glory. If we go back to verse 18 at the top there, and I'm not going to reread it. Then 90, chapter 90, verse 38 of First Enoch, it says, I went on seeing until all their kindred were transformed and became snow white cows, and the first among them became something, and that something became a great beast with huge horns on its head. The Lord of the sheep rejoiced over it and over all the cows. Then verse 14, he says, I kept seeing till that man who writes down the names of the shepherds and elevates them before the Lord of the sheep came. It is he who helped him and revealed to him everything. Thus help came down from, for that is ram. Verse 9, I kept seeing till those things grew horns, but the ravens crushed their horns. Then I kept seeing till one great horn sprouted on one sheep. He opened their eyes, and they had visions in them, and their eyes were open. So we see there how that they used the animals to show forth that of men, different nations, things of that sort in the writings of the pseudographic literature. And we read those just to make sure to see the things that they did during that time. And also, we find that some of the things that are written in the pseudographic and also the apocryphal, they are not true. We have to make a distinction in reference to that because of what the Bible says. And so, basically, we're looking at these writings of these uninspired people that write them, and also the books that they're therein. And we're not simply saying that everything they say is true. Frequently used is made by the apocalyptics of the wild beasts and birds praised to symbolize the nation of the Gentiles. I thought it was interesting in reference to that. No doubt they were influenced with in this by such passage as Ezekiel 39, chapter 17, perhaps too by the book of Job and the book of Proverbs, where great interest is shown in nature and frequent references are made to animal figures of many kinds. The most extensively is found in First Enoch, beginning in chapter 89, beginning in verse 10. We'll read that in just a few moments, and also some other places. But in those passages where the various Gentile nations are described under the figures of lions and tigers and wolves and dogs and hyenas and wild boars and foxes and squirrels and swine and falcons and vultures and kites and eagles and ravens. In the testament of Joseph, 19 and verse 8, however, the lion is used to represent Judah, and in 2nd Esdras, chapter 11, verse 37, it symbolizes the Messiah. So we have to be very careful when we start looking at some of those symbolisms. And so in this latter case, the lion speaking with the voice of a man upbraids and then destroys the eagle, chapter 11, beginning verse 37, which, as the author tells us, chapter 12, verse 11, represents the fourth kingdom in the vision of Daniel, Daniel 7, verse 23, so which is here identified with Rome, and we understand that. And Bible class last night, Corey brought that out. And so in Daniel's vision, there come up out of the sea four great beasts belonging to no recognizable species. The first is like a lion with eagle wings, chapter 7 and verse 4. The second is like a bear having 3 ribs in its mouth, verse 5. And the third is like a leopard with 4 wings. And the fourth is a beast with 10 horns and great iron teeth. Now, and those have some meaning. If we were studying the book of Daniel, we would talk more about those by means of this strange symbolism, and whose roots go back far into ancient mythology. The author depicts Daniel depicts the 4 great empires of Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece, and Rome. Basically, we always say the Babylonian kingdom, then the Medo-Persian kingdom, and also Greece with Alexander the Great, and then the Roman Empire. But in first Enoch, beginning in verse 10, there it says, "Then they began to bear the beasts of the field and the birds. And there arose out of them all classes of population, lions and leopards and wolves and snakes and hyenas and wild boars and foxes and squirrels and swines and hawks and eagles and kites and striped cows and ravens." And then in the testament of Joseph, it says, "And I saw that a virgin was born from Judah. I saw that a virgin was born from Judah, wearing a linen stole, and from her was born a spotless lamb." Now we understand that. At his left there was something like a lion, and the wild beasts rushed against him, but the lamb conquered them and destroyed them, trampling them under foot. So we would understand that actually referred to the Christ. Second Esdras, chapter 11, verse 37, it says, "And I beheld, and lo, as it were a roaring lion chased out of the wood. I saw, he sent out a man's voice unto the eagle and said, Hear thou, I will talk with thee, and the high shall say unto thee, Art thou not thou it that remainest of the 4 beasts whom I made to reign in my world, that the end of times might come through them?" In chapter 12, verse 7, "The eagle whom thou sawest came from the sea is the kingdom which was seen in the vision of thy brother Daniel." So again, symbolism. But just as men and nations are symbolized by animals, so good angels are symbolized by men, and fallen angels by stars. This latter usage is found in particular in First Enoch 85 through 90, where Enoch in a vision sees a star and representing Azazel, the prince of the fallen angels, fallen from heaven, followed by many other stars representing all the hosts, beginning in chapter 86, verse 1. And another version of this story tells how the fallen angels cohabited with the daughters of men, who produced a monstrous race of giants. First Enoch chapter 7, beginning verse 1, and chapter 15, beginning verse 1, and chapter 86, beginning verse 1. And so these giants are destroyed, though, by the flood, but their spirits are let loose as demons to corrupt all mankind. Chapter 15 and verse 8, the fallen angels called watchers, and the name is used the first time in Daniel 4, verses 13, 17, and 23, are to be punished even before the final judgment, but the punishment of the demons will be reserved unto that last great day, First Enoch chapter 10, chapter 16, chapter 19. Now, in First Enoch chapter 7, and I put down verses 1 through 6, 1, 6 should be there, to chapter 7 and verse 1. Let me change that right quick there. It says, "And they took wives unto themselves, and every one respectively chose one woman for himself, and they began to go unto them. And they taught them magical medicine and incantations, the cutting of roots, and taught them about plants. And the women became pregnant and gave birth to great giants whose heights were 300 cubits." So 300 cubits, that would be 150. That'd be 300 cubits is 540 inches divided by 12. That's 40 something feet. Is that right? 300 cubic cubics, 300 cubics. They'd say feet. Cubics is 18 inches. So that's a lot. So these giants consumed the produce of all the people until the people detested feeding them. So the giants turned against the people in order to eat them. They began to sin against birds and wild beasts and reptiles and fish, and their flesh was devoured the one by the other. They drank blood, and then the earth brought an accusation against the oppressors. In chapter 15, beginning verse 1, verse 12, he raised me up and said to me with his voice, Enoch, I then heard, do not fear, Enoch, righteous men, scribes of righteousness, scribe of righteousness, come near to me and hear my voice. Tell the watchers of heaven on whose behalf you have been sent to intercede, it is meet for you that you intercede on behalf of man and not man on your behalf. For what reason have you abandoned the high, the holy, and the eternal heaven? Slept with women, defiled yourselves with the daughters of people, taking wives, acting like children of earth, and begetting great sons. Surely you used to be holy and spiritual, the living ones, possess eternal life, but now you have defiled yourselves with women and with the blood of the flesh, begotten children. You have lusted with blood of the people, like them producing blood and flesh, which die and perish. On that account, I have given you wives in order that seeds might be sown unto them and children born by them, so that the deeds that are done upon the earth will not be withheld from you. Indeed, you formerly you were spiritual, having eternal life and immortal in all the generations of the world. That it's why formerly I did not make wise for you for the dwelling of the spiritual beings which is in heaven. And he begins in verse 8. It says, but now the giants who are born from the union of the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because their dwelling shall be upon the earth beside the earth. Evil spirits have come out of their bodies, because from that day, from the day that they were created from the holy ones, they became the watchers, and their origin is the spiritual foundation. They will become evil upon the earth and shall be called evil spirits, dwelling of the spiritual beings of heaven. But the dwelling of the spirits of the earth, which are born upon the earth, is in the earth. The spirits of the giants oppress each other. They will corrupt, fall, and be excited, and fall upon the earth and cause sorrow. And they eat no food, nor become thirsty, nor find obstacles. Each spirit shall rise up against the children of the people and against the women, because they have proceeded forth from them. And in chapter 86, he says, again, I saw a vision with my eyes as I was sleeping, and saw the lofty heaven. And I looked, behold, a star fell down from heaven, but managed to rise and eat and to be pastured among the cows. And I saw these big and dark cows, and behold, they are changed, all changed. Their cattle sheds, their pastures, and their calves, and they began to lament with each other. Once again, I saw a vision. I observed the sky, and behold, I saw many stars descending and casting themselves down from the sky upon the first star, and they became bovids, bovids among those calves, and were pastured toward together with them in the midst. And I kept observing, and behold, I saw all of them extending their sexual organs like horses, and commencing to mount upon the heifers, the bovids, and they, the latter, all became pregnant and be born elephants and camels and donkeys. And so the cattle became fearful and frightful of them, and began to bite with their teeth and swallow and to gorge with their horns. And they began to eat the bovids. And behold, all the children of the earth began to tremble and to shake before them and flee to them. My thoughts in reference to this, because it's not inspired, we understand it's not inspired, that probably what he was trying to do, or seems like he's trying to do, is show where all kinds of animals came from. So he begins in chapter 15 and verse 8. Now the giants who were born from the union of the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because their dwelling shall be upon the earth and inside the earth. Evil spirits have come out of their bodies, because from that day they were created from the holy ones. They became the watchers. Their first origin is spiritual foundation. They will become evil upon the earth and shall be called evil spirits. Now the dwelling of the spirit beings of heaven is heaven, but the dwelling of the spirits of the earth, which are born of the earth, is the earth. So the spirits and the giants oppress one another. They will corrupt, fall, be excited, fall upon the earth and cause sorrow. They eat no food, nor thirsty, nor find obstacles. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of the people and against the women, because they have proceeded forth from them. Chapter 10, he says, and in order that he may be sent into the fire on the great judgment, chapter 16, verse 1, from the days of the slaughter and the destruction and the death of the giants, and they corrupt without incurring judgment. They will corrupt until the day of great conclusion, until the great age is consummated, until everything is concluded upon the watchers and the wicked one. Then notice in chapter 19, and Uriel said to me, here shall stand in many different appearances the spirits of the angels which have united themselves with women. They have defiled the people and will lead them into error, so that they will offer sacrifices to the demons as unto gods unto the great day of judgment, in which they shall be judged till they are finished. Now you stop again. I think when we read all that, it is amazing that these people who are inspired tell us all this different stuff that they're telling us about angels and women and all these different things, and yet God in the books of Genesis all the way through the Old Testament never tell us any of it. So it's really something. So another form of symbolism to be found in the apocalyptic writings is that of number, especially the number 3, 4, 7, 10, and 12 are multiples of them. Each of these have a peculiar religious significance in the Old Testament. At least some of them appear fairly frequently in Babylonian and Persian. Special importance attaches to the number 7, denoting completion or perfection, which appears in apocalyptic writing throughout the whole of the intertestamental period in the passages too numerous to mention. And that is actually true, that we find that and we come to that conclusion that it is denoting completion, especially like if we were to go over and study the book of Revelation, talk about the 7 that's used here. But then we have the Ezra legend. And it's interesting, light is thrown on the tradition of this apocalyptic literature by the so-called Israel legend contained in chapter 14 of 2nd Esdras. But no doubt excerpted from an independent source. It tells how, as Ezra sat under an oak tree, he heard a voice calling him out of a bush, bidding him to lay upon his heart the signs which God would show him, just as Moses had done in days gone by. And so by the present world order was fashioned drawing to a close, and he must soon ascend to be with the Messiah. Thereupon he been to set aside 40 days in which, under divine inspiration, he would dictate 5 chosen companions all that had happened in the world since the beginning, even the things which were written by the law. Now, again, we know that this is not true. Ezra did as was commanded, and in 40 days dictated to 5 men 94 books. This injunction then came from the Almighty. The 24 books that thou hast written, published, that the worthy and unworthy may read therein, but the 70 lives thou shalt keep to deliver them to the wise among people. So the account is a reapplication of familiar tradition that Ezra was the restorer of the law of Moses, which it was believed and had burned at 14 verse 21 when Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. But on Mount Sinai had received a divine revelation which God told him many wondrous things, shown him the secrets of time, declared him to the end of the season, chapter 14, verse 5. The words of the law he had to publish openly, but the secret traditions concerning the crisis of the world he had to keep to himself, 14 verse 6. So it seems obvious that the writer has in mind here the apocalyptic tradition believed to have been received from Moses together with the sacred law, now restored by Ezra under the inspiration of God. So the 24 books which were to be published openly were the books of the canonical scripture, and the 70 which were to be kept secret and delivered only to the wise were the esoteric apocalyptic writings. And so we find the number 70 is no doubt used symbolically to signify a comprehensive figure, and it's probably meant to include not only those apocalyptic books, known and unknown, which appears under the name of Moses, but also the wider range of apocalyptic writings, including this book itself in which these events are recorded. So this Ezra legend then came in effect for the apocalyptic tradition, a valued and authoritative place within Judaism. That is a very important statement because it helps us to understand when we read about Judaism and about the different groups of them and some of the things that they believe. It is no doubt that it reflects the consciousness belief in certain apocalyptic circles at that time and that this type of literature, like the oral tradition itself, Perky Aboth, we talked about him before, we traced back to its sources in the revelation given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. It had been suggested that in Ezra and his 5 companions, there may be a covert allusion to the great Rabbi Johanna ben Zakkai, refounder of Judaism after AD 66 and 70, and its 5 famous disciples. If this be so, it strengthens still further the argument that the author is claiming from the apocalyptic traditions an essential place in the life of Reformed Judaism. And so we see some of that in Reformed Judaism. Now here we have a second Esdras chapter 14, and we're going to read that because of some of the things that's in there. And I've got one thing underlined. It says, and it came to pass upon the 3rd day, I sat on an oak, and behold, there came a voice in the bush over against me and said, Esdras, Esdras. And I said, here I am, Lord. Sounds like Isaiah chapter 6. And I stood up on my feet, and said he unto me in the bush, I did manifestly reveal myself unto Moses and talked with him when my people served in Egypt. And I sent him and led my people out of Egypt and brought him up to the mount of where I held him by me a long season. And now watch this. And told him many wondrous things, and showed him the secrets of the times and the end, and commanded him, saying, these words shall thou declare, and these shall thou hide. And now I say unto thee, thou lay up in thy heart the signs that I have shown in the dreams that thou hast seen, and the interpretations which thou hast heard. For thou shalt be taken away from all, and from henceforth I shall remain with my son, and with such as be like me, till the times be ended. For the world has lost his youth, and the times began to wax old. For the world is divided into 12 parts, and the 10 parts of it are gone already, and half of the 10th. And there remaineth that which is about half of the 10th. Now therefore set thy house in order, and reprove thy people, comfort some such of them as to be in trouble, and now renounce corruption. So let go forth the mortal thoughts, cast away the burdens of men, put off now the weak nature, and set aside the thoughts that are most heavy unto thee, and haste thee to flee from these times. For yet greater evils than those which thou hast seen happen shall be done afterwards. For look, how much the world shall be weaker through age, so much the more shall evil increase upon them that dwell therein. For the time is far away, and leasing is hard at hand. For now hasteth the vision to come which thou hast seen. So then answered I before thee and said, behold, Lord, I will go as thou hast commanded me, and reprove the people which thou are present, but they that shall be born afterwards, who shall admonish them? Thus the world is set in darkness, and they that dwell therein are without light. Now watch this. For thy law is burnt, therefore no man knoweth the things that are done of thee, or the work that thou shalt begin. If I have found grace before thee, send the Holy Ghost unto thee, and shall write all that been done in the world since the beginning, which were written in the law, thy law, that men may find thy path, and that they will live in the latter days may live. And he answered me, saying, go thy way, gather the people together, and say unto them that they seek not thee not for 40 days. But look thou prepared thee many box trees, and take with thee Syria, Deberia, Salimia, Canis, and Asa, that's the five which are ready to write swiftly, and come thither, and I shall light a candle of understanding in thy heart, which shall not be put out till the things be performed, which thou shalt begin to write. And thou hast done some things that shall thou publish, and some things that shalt thou show secretly to the wise. Tomorrow this hour shall thou begin to write. Now again, we know that he's not writing by inspiration, because there was no prophet left. Therefore, there's no need for a revelation, because God had said all that God was going to say, and he's going to put it in motion. So he goes on, he says, then went I forth as he commanded, and gathered all the people together, and said, hear these words, O Lord. Our father at the beginning were strangers in Egypt, from which they were delivered, and received the law of life, which they kept not, which you have transgressed after them. Then was the land, even the land of Sion, parted among you by lot, but your fathers and ye yourself have done unrighteousness and have not kept the ways which the highest commanded you. Now we know that to be true. For as much, he says, as he is righteous, he is a righteous judge. He took from you in time the thing that he had given you. Now are you here and your brethren among you. Therefore, if so be that ye will subdue your own understanding and reform your hearts, ye shall be kept alive, and after death you shall obtain mercy. For after death shall the judgment come, when we shall live again, and then shall the names of the righteous be manifested, the works of the ungodly shall be declared. Let no man therefore come unto me or seek after me these 40 days. Now, if he's talking about the end of the world, we understand that. But is he talking about the premillennial doctrine? In other words, that everything's going to be restored back to that of the earth once Jesus comes for the second time. So he says, I took the 5 men as he commanded me. We went into the field and remained there. And the next day, behold, a voice called me, said, Esdras, open thy mouth and drink that I give thee to drink. And I opened my mouth, and behold, he reached me a full cup, which was full as it were with water, but the color of it was like fire. And I took it and drank, and when I had drunk of it, my heart uttered understanding, and wisdom grew in my breast, for my spirit strengthens my memory. And my mouth was open and shut no more. And the highest gave understanding to the 5 men, and they wrote the wonderful visions of the night that were told, which they knew not. And they sat 40 days, and they wrote in the day, and at night they ate bread. As for me, I spake in the day, and I held not my tongue by night. In 40 days, they wrote 204 books. And it came to pass that when the 40 days were fulfilled, and the highest saying, the first that thou hast written, published openly, that the worthy and unworthy may read. But keep the 70 lies, that thou mayest deliver them only to such as be wise among the people. For in them is the spring of understanding, the foundation of wisdom, and the stream of knowledge. And I did. So again, like I said, not inspired. But then we come to that of the apocalyptic and prophecy. The apocalyptic writers believe that they stood in the true prophetic tradition of the Old Testament scriptures, and they were convinced that, like the prophets of old, they too had a message from God. In particular, they were concerned with the predictive element, which they found in prophecy, which had been rarely neglected in the rabbinic methods of their day. And so we say that, but we know that when we read and we study the Old Testament prophets, and then we turn to the New Testament and we find the condition of that of the Jewish people, we know that they did not understand what the prophets were prophesying. So their method was to fasten on predictions made in the past, which had not been fulfilled in the literal sense of passages, concerned to seeing them hidden in symbolic meanings, which they would proceed to recast and reinterpret. By thus reinterpreting and reapplying the message of prophecy to succeeding generations, they showed it to be not only a foretelling, but a foretelling of the Word of God. For this reason, apocalyptic has sometimes been described as unfulfilled prophecy. And to a large extent, this is true. An example of this is to be found in Jeremiah's prediction of 7 years of captivity before the final restoration. He does this in Jeremiah 25, 11, 29, and 11. He says there's going to be 70 years. They're going to be there 70 years. And so if we were to look at like 606 BC and knock off 70 years, we're looking at 536, which is interpreted by the writer of Daniel as 70 weeks of years, and by the writer of 1 Enoch as 70 reigns of the 70 shepherds or angels commissioned by the God to shepherd his people of Israel. And another example is the prophecy recorded in Daniel 7. So there, the fourth beast obviously represents Greece, and that's not true. It represents the fourth. It represents that of Rome. But in second Esdras, 12:11 is given an entirely new interpretation. That represents Rome. Back in Daniel, the Medes and the Persians were together in the third kingdom. And so the writer of the book that we're using, he missed that altogether. Second Esdras 12:11 says, the eagle which thou sawest come from the sea is the kingdom which was seen in the vision by my brother Daniel. So the form which the apocalyptic message assumes was in many respects different from that of the old, that of the prophets, but nevertheless it was a true continuation and development of the prophetic message, and in several respects brought it to the logical conclusion. So this can be illustrated by reference to the 3 aspects of the message their conception of the unity of history, their eschatological ideas, and their belief concerning the form of divine inspiration. And so when we stop and we think about the unity of history, now, the fellow that we've talked about a number of times, Dr. R.H. Charles, again, he's a premillennialist, takes very radical critical positions in his idea of God and the idea of man, sin, and death, on his conceptions of the future life and Sheol, the survivor of the soul, or conscious afterlife, fulfilling prophecy. He has spent his life in studying the writings that are not inspired. Therefore, listen closely to what he has to say in the following. Now, like I said, he spent his time reading what you and I are reading and knowing that it's not inspired. But Dr. Charles maintained that it was apocalyptic and not prophecy. That was the first to grasp the great idea that all history and human, cosmological and spiritual, is a unity. Daniel was the first to teach the unity of all human history, and that every fresh phrase of his history was a further state in the development of God's purpose. Now, it's what Daniel wrote was a further development of God's purpose, not in the sense that Dr. Charles had said. Dr. Charles, in writing this, is not quite fair to the prophets and the zeal that he has for apocalyptics. And so the belief in monotheism, that is just mono meaning one, and the belief in the all-embracing purpose of God are qualities, and these are to be found implicitly in Amos and explicitly in Deutero Isaiah. Now, we stop there because you'll notice the note that Deuteronomy Isaiah, also called the second Isaiah, second Old Testament book, chapter of Isaiah, chapter 40 to 55. But I want you to notice, if you will, in John chapter 12 and verse 38, also to show you how inspired the Bible is, and to show you that the Bible answers that era. And I don't understand how these theologians come up with this Deutero, or the second Isaiah, because when you read John chapter 12 and verse 38, he just simply, or Jesus simply says, it says there, John as he writes, in verse 38, he says that the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who have believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That's a quotation from Isaiah 53 and verse 1. Then in verse 39, he says, therefore they cannot believe, because that Isaiah said again, notice that Isaiah said again, he have blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, and they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. These things said Isaiah when he saw his glory and spake of him. Now, that's a quotation from that of Isaiah 6, verse 1, 9, and 10. So there's no such thing as a second Isaiah. Jesus says it's Isaiah. Therefore, it's Isaiah. It's only one Isaiah. There's not two Isaiahs. Now, some of those theologians will come along, and there is, they point out there's three Isaiahs. But if we read the New Testament, we find there's only one Isaiah, because of the quotations that Jesus has given there in the Gospel of John. There is only one Isaiah. As we look at that, it is later in origin that the preceding chapters, though not as late as the following chapters, is what they try to say. So the glance of these prophets sweeps indiscriminately over past, present, and future, uniting all the history into a single plan. They conceived and controlled by that of God. Now, it may be true, as Dr. Charles says, that whereas prophecy incidentally dealt with the past and devoted itself to the present and the future, as in rising organically out of the past, apocalyptic, though its interest lies chiefly in the future, as containing the solutions to the problems of the past and the present, and took within its purview things past, present, and to come. Now, again, we know God's eternal purpose, and he's revealing that of his eternal purpose. In other words, there's a time frame, and only God knows that time frame. But this does not necessarily imply, however, that the prophets did not therefore grasp the idea of the unity of history. Indeed, the evidence of their writings imply that they did, but if the prophets were the first to see the grasp this idea, it was left to the apocalyptics to complete the logic of it. Now, the idea is, though, is that the prophets were inspired, and they spoke those things by inspiration, and they were predictive. We have to make sure that we understand it's what they spoke was unfulfilled prophecy, as we pointed out earlier. So following the lead of the prophets, the apocalyptics, set about relating the data of history to one another and trace to the connection between them in divine purpose underlying history, they saw and interpreted the events of history of species, well, the Latin there, observing in its apparent confusion and order and a goal. So the apocalyptics believed in God, and they believed that he had some purpose for the world. Well, sure he did. He made it, created it the way that he wanted it, because there was a foundation, there was an eternal purpose before the world. And so, and that his power was equal to its achievement. So their faith goes beyond the faith in the divine control of history, indeed. It is a faith, he says, in the divine initiative in history to attain of its final goal. So the advance of the apocalyptics on the prophets in this respect is to be seen in two ways, according to Dr. Charles. He says they began to work out history in vast periods, not only systematically, but deterministically. There was known among them a secret tradition concerning the crisis of the world history associated with the name of Moses, which takes a different form in different writers. This idea of a secret tradition. But in the assumption of Moses, this is one of those pseudographic books, chapter 10, verse 12, the writer describes Moses as saying, from my death until his advent, that there shall be CCL times, that is 250 weeks or 1,750 years, which were added to the 2,500 years which has elapsed before the death of Moses, makes the duration of the world 85 jubilees or 4,250 years. Now, this scheme of history is systematized still more in the Apocalypse of Weeks, first chapter 93, verse 1 through 10, and 91, 12 through 17, where we find that it is divided into 10 weeks of unequal length, each marked by some great event. From the standpoint of the writer, the first 7 weeks are the part, and the last 3 weeks are in the future, the Messianic kingdom. Being set up in the 8th week and continue to the close of the 10th week when final judgment takes place. Now, again, we have to realize that it is not, he's not writing by inspiration there. What he has said is not true. In other writings, the division is made into 7 parts, the testimony of Abraham, chapter 17 and 19, or into 12 parts, the apocalyptic of that of Abraham, chapter 20 and 28, and Esdras, chapter 14 and 11. Second by Ruth, 53 and 56. So these arranged divisions of time form a unity of history, he says, in and through which can be traced the unfailing purpose of God. The present age is brought to its close in final judgment or the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. Now, because he says that in the Messianic kingdom, we understand that he is a premillennialist in reference to the writer, in reference to what he is saying. Now, he tells us in First Enoch, chapter 93, and 10 verses, he says, then after that Enoch had happened to be recounted from the books, Enoch said, concerning the children of righteousness, concerning the elect ones of the world, concerning the plan of truth, I will speak these things, my children. Verily I, Enoch, myself, and let you know about it, according to that which was revealed to me from the heavenly vision, that which I have learned from the worlds of the holy angels and understood from the Messianic tablets. He then began to recount from the books and said, I was born the 7th during the first week, during the which time judgment and righteousness continue to endure, and after me there shall arise the second week, great and evil things, deceit should grow, and there in the first consummation, which he says will take place. But therein also a certain man shall be saved. After it is ended, injustice shall become greater, and he shall make a law for the sinners. Then after that, at the completion of the 3rd week, a certain man shall be elected to the plan of righteous judgment, and after him one another shall emerge in the eternal plan of righteousness. And after that, the completion of the 4th week, visions of the old and righteous one shall be seen, and a law shall be made with a fence for all generations. After that, in the 5th week, a completion of glory, a house and the kingdom shall be built. And after that, in the 6th week, those who happen to be in it shall be them be blindfolded, and the hearts of all shall forget wisdom. Therein, a certain man shall ascend, and it shall at its completion, the house of the kingdom shall be burnt with fire, and therein the whole plan of the chosen root shall be dispersed. After that, in the 7th week, an apostate generation shall rise. Its deeds shall be many, and all of them criminal. And as it completion, there shall be the elect ones and righteousness from the eternal plan of righteousness, to whom shall be sevenfold instructions concerning all the flock. Now, when you look at all that, you can see something like a mixture of what Daniel had said, and also about what some truths that the Old Testament tells, and we find out in that of the New Testament. begins also in chapter 91, beginning verse 12. Then after that, there shall occur the second eighth week, the week of righteousness. A sword shall be given to it in order that judgment shall be executed in righteousness on the oppressors, and sinners shall be delivered into the hands of the righteous. At its completion, they shall acquire great things through their righteousness. A house shall be built for the great king in glory forevermore. And after that, in the ninth week of the righteous judgment shall be revealed in the whole world. All the deeds of the sinners shall depart from upon the earth and shall be written off for eternal destruction. And all the people shall direct their sights to the path of uprightness. And after this matter, on the 10th week in the seventh part, there shall be eternal judgment, and it shall be executed by the angels of the eternal heaven. We know that's not true. Judgment is going to be executed by that of Jesus the Christ. The great judgment, he says, which emanates from all the angels. The first heaven shall depart and pass away, a new heaven shall appear, and all the powers of heaven shall shine forever. Again, kind of an allusion to some things found in other books of the Old Testament, also in the book of Revelation. Verse 17, then after that there shall be many weeks without number forever. It shall be a time of goodness and righteousness, and sin shall no more be heard of forever. So the only way that would be in heaven itself. So not only did the apocalypse divide up history into different periods of time, telling us about all those different weeks and so forth. They conceived, thus they conceived had been determined before it had been should be. I guess that was a word before. They've been on it. Of the will by the will of God, and shall be revealed to his servants. So God had set down on the heavenly and tablets the fixed order of the events. Let me do something right quick, which there could be no deviation from those. And so, according to that, Daniel 11, verse 36 is that which is determined shall be done. But what Daniel is telling us, if we were to go back and study Daniel, is that Daniel is pointing out to us the coming of that of the kingdom, that is the church, the kingdom of God. And he shows also to us about the history of the things that were going to take place in those four different kingdoms that he set up, that it's Babylon and the Medo-Persian, Greece, and then that of Rome. Daniel was getting at, not some of the things that this author is saying in reference to what he has gathered from that of doing and studying the apocalyptic literature and the pseudo literature. He had determined beforehand the destinies of Israel and the nations according to the Moses chapter 2 and verse 4. I can't remember what the ASS stands for. Period. Assumption of Moses. There it is right there. Assumption of Moses. And so we would find, and he recorded all the deeds of mankind in Jubilees chapter 1 and verse 29, and the nations there. He would bring this. I lost my place. He would bring this present age to the close when the predetermined time was fulfilled. And so we know from what we study in reference to that of the patriarchal age of the Old Testament and also the New Testament, the patriarchal age, how that it had a fulfillment in the sense that the Mosaic age came where God chose out a group of people that would be descendants of that of Abraham, and they were given a written law, where under the patriarchal law, they just had the law of the heart, as we would sometimes say, in other words, the moral law, as we would say, not the law of the heart. And so men could not alter what was predetermined by God, but they could at least investigate the scheme of history and try to discover at what point in it they themselves stood by identifying in past historical events specific evidence or events in the scheme. I've often wondered, you go back to Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15, Genesis chapter 17, and Genesis chapter 22, and over, God says to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he says, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, of all the families shall be blessed. Could not the Jewish people during the days of Exodus all the way down to Malachi come to some kind of conclusion, going back and looking what it says, well, this hasn't come to pass. All nations would be the Jews and Gentiles would be one. But see, they were so prejudiced, they could not see that. Calculation of times, therefore, became a very important part of the apocalyptic job, and led them almost always to the conclusion that they were standing in the last days. Now, behind everything from the very beginning to the very end, lay the predetermined purpose of God, binding the whole history of men in history into one, according to our author. But you notice there that we pointed out that they were standing in the last days. They always thought they were in the last days, even after the gospel was preached. Remember in First Thessalonians, and the Apostle Paul, basically what he's writing is telling them, says, look, because they thought the time of the end was coming. They thought they were in the last days and everything was coming to the end. That's what they thought. So he even had to remind them in Second Thessalonians because they misunderstood what he said in First Thessalonians. And so he had to point it out to them. No one would know the time, as Peter would also go finally point out also in 2 Peter chapter 3. The assumption of Moses in chapter 12, beginning in verse 4, it says there, when Joshua had finished these words, he cast himself, in other words, he's saying that this is the testament of Moses, and Joshua was writing. He cast himself again at the feet of Moses, and Moses took his hand and raised him into the seat before him, and answered and said to him, Joshua, do not despise yourself, but set your mind at ease and hear my words. All the nations which are in the earth God has created, and us he has foreseen them and us from the beginning of the creation of the earth unto the end of the age, and nothing has been neglected by him, even to the least, but all things he hath foreseen and caused all, he says, to come forth. Yes, all things which are to be in this earth, the Lord has foreseen and looked, and they are brought forward into the light the Lord has on their behalf appointed me to pray for their sins and make intercession for them. That's true. Moses did make intercession. He says, for not for any virtue of strength of time, but of his good pleasure, how his compassion and long suffering fall into my lot. For I say unto you, Joshua, it is not on account of the godliness of this people that you shall root out the nations. Lights of the heavens, the foundations of the earth have been made and approved by God and are under the signet ring of his right hand. Those, therefore, who do and fulfill the commandments of God shall increase and be prosperous, but those who sin and set not the commandment shall be without blessing before mentioned, and they shall be punished with many torments by the nation, but wholly to root out and destroy them is not permitted, for God will go forth for who has foreseen all things forever, and his covenant has been established, and by the oath which. Now, the thing of it is that he makes a point there. He says that it will not be they will not be destroyed because of Genesis 49 and verse 10, because of the Messiah would come out of that of Judah. So there's some points that are true there, but still it's not inspired. Jubilees chapter 1 and verse 29, he says, and the angel of the presence who went before the camp of Israel took the tablets of the division of years, and from the time of creation of the law of testimony according to their weeks of years, according to the Jubilees, year by year, throughout all the full number of the Jubilees, from the day of creation until the day of the new creation, when the heavens and the earth and all their creatures shall be renewed according to the powers of heaven, and according to the whole earth and the earth, whole nature of the earth, until the sanctuary of the Lord is created in Jerusalem upon Mount Zion. And it's a pre-millennial idea. And all the lives will be renewed from healing and peace and blessing for all the elect of Israel, in order that it might be thus from the day from that day unto the days of the earth. Now you stop for a moment and just think that if that's the type of reading that they were doing during that of the in between the testaments, and even some of the reading after the testaments, that's the reason why the Jewish people didn't understand that it was a spiritual kingdom and not a physical kingdom. Second, Esdras says in chapter 4, verse 36, and unto these things Uriel, archangel, gave them answer and said, even when the number of the seed is filled in you, we have weighed the world in balance. In chapter 11, 44, the highest also have looked upon the proud times, and behold, they are ended, and his nations are fulfilled. And so there are two factors that help the apocalyptic to widen and develop their conception that of the unity of history. And one of the external influences was the idea which we've studied, Zoroastrianism. The other was the internal influence of beliefs and conditions within Judaism and within the Jewish state. Now, remember that when we were studying about the influences of all those people that were around the Jewish people, is that they took in some of those things. Now, it wasn't that since they were actually listening to everything that Moses had written in the 5 books of Moses and patriarch and in the law and all the things that happened thereafter with the prophets and so forth, in reference to that of the coming of the kingdom, that they had those outside influences upon them. And therefore, instead of listening to what the prophets were saying in reference to it's a spiritual kingdom, they ended up understanding that it was a physical kingdom. Now, the characteristics of Zoroaster, his was the idea that the world would last for a period of 12,000 years, consisting of 4 eras of 3,000 years each. During the first of these, everything is invisible. During the second, the great god Ahura Mazda creates the material world and man. And during the third, Angra Mania, the great evil spirit has power over men. During the fourth, men gradually approach a state of perfection. I was trying to look for something, and it says through that of the work that is going on, perfection through the work of Sheoshiant, the Savior. And so the Iranian writers, that is, divide up history in great world epics and work out elaborate schemes and systems of measurement and such much in the same way as the Jewish apocalyptics did. And there can be no doubt that these apocalypses were greatly influenced by the Iranian thought in their particular respect. So it cannot be without significance, for example, that the number 12, which plays such an important role in that of Zoroastrianism, should appear so frequently in the Jewish divisions of history. There are 12 divisions of history. That's the way we divide it up. The Jewish apocalyptic writers then took over the Iranian conception of the great world ethics and used it to make more vivid and more wide embracing ideas, the idea which they had received from the prophets of a unity of history brought about the unfailing purpose of God. Now, the second factor influencing these writers was the nature of prevailing beliefs and conditions within Palestine. Now, the revolt, the Maccabean revolt was 167 BC, all the way down to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The Jewish people had been welded together in a nation, and in many respects, very much like other small nations around Palestine, but they were more conscious of the differences between themselves and others that they were than they were of the similarities. The Jewish nation could not be compared in material power with the great empire of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and nevertheless it believed that it had an imperial part to play in the history of civilization. So this is the impression conveyed by the book of Daniel. For example, as it contemplates the fulfillment of God's purpose in and through the people, his people, the Jews, here the great Gentile kingdom, like the Greek supremacy of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, which seem to so overwhelming and terrible, are shown as a phase in the world process. In is the kingdom of God. In other words, all nations are going to make up the kingdom of God. We understand that. Now, again, they understand that it's going to be, again, a physical material kingdom. But in the visions recorded in chapters 2, 7, and 8, the writer, that is Daniel, sees the fall of great empires of Babylon, the Medo-Persian, Greece, no longer as that of Jeremiah and Ezekiel are the pronouncements of divine judgment given piecemeal. Here in Daniel, we have, in the words of Dr. F.C. Burkett, philosophy of universal history. In other words, the Jewish nation, small though it is, it sees itself again back against the back of these mighty powers. It outlooks how has become truly a cosmopolitan, and it is not inferior to the great nations. Rather, it is superior, for they must perish. But Israel will inherit the kingdom prepared by God. Now, again, that's the premillennial idea, and I'll make a note of that. Panorama of world events in which the nation was to play such a vital part made possible for the apocalyptic day. Much wider view of the unity of history that they had been possible for the prophets before them. If the Jewish people would listen to the prophets, they would have understood more. If they had come to a knowledge of what they were saying, understood it would have been a spiritual kingdom. But even the apostles, it really sometimes, as I read and I get over to Acts chapter 1, and all of a sudden they asked Jesus, "Are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel this time?" So they were thinking of a physical, material. But you have to realize that if they were reading and had been taught, if their forefathers had been taught, that is before the time of Christ, had been taught all of these things that our author of the book is telling us, then we can understand why they had that idea that it is a physical, material kingdom, that Messiah was set on the throne of God in the city of Jerusalem, and the Jewish people would be the people of the world. And so, divine purpose, which ran through all history, would not, however, cease with the climax of history. For the Most High has made not one age, but two, according to 2 Ezra, chapter 7 and verse 50. The reason why he said, talks about the cosmos cannot be reduced to a harmonious whole. There is a marked contrast between this present age of ungodliness and the future age of righteousness. And nevertheless, there is a link between the temporal and the eternal orders which cannot be broken. Purpose of God, which binds the two together, and which will at last be vindicated in the vindication of his people. And so the apocalyptic study of history passes over into eschatology. The purpose of God, which finds its actualization in history, must seek its purification beyond that of history. Now, we have those in the church today that basically they're going back to eschatology, and everything that we find in the Bible from the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation, chapter 22, has been fulfilled. That's what the book of Revelation was talking about, everything being fulfilled that Jesus, that the prophets and the law and the Psalms had said would be concerning Jesus, and then everything that Jesus had told the disciples, all that stuff had been fulfilled. All of those prophecies would be fulfilled at the destruction of Jerusalem. That way, that would simply tell us that Jesus would come, that he would set up his kingdom. You know, we have people in the church that actually believe that. The next thing that we'll talk about is the last thing. And again, this is false doctrine. It's premillennialism. This Dr. R.H. Charles does right in pointing out, the book says, prophecy and apocalyptic, each has its own doctrine of last things. Well, it can't be different. If it's from God, it would not be different. So in emphasizing the difference between them, it couldn't be different. God gave it. But it should also be remembered that the broad lines of prophetic eschatology taken over by the apocalyptics and remained an essential part of their teaching despite the modifications and developments through which that teaching went. Now, they depended upon the writings between the testaments, the pseudo-writings, the apocryphal, with some of this, as we've already seen. As we shall see it later, we would find that the idea prevailed in certain apocalyptic circles. And so since it did that, then we would idea in these circles that the kingdom belonged to this world. Notice that, in which the Jews would triumph and the Gentiles would be overthrown. Now, then there would be the bringing into the Gentiles as the premillennialism. So this hope in the restoration of Israel was in line with much prophetic teachings of the Old Testament. Well, they're right in saying that, but they missed the point. Jesus said, and he said unto them, these are the words which I spake unto you, which I was, while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, the prophets, and in Psalms concerning me, all things, he said. So elsewhere, however, the influence of the Persian thought, he goes on, the author does, was deeply felt with its dualistic view of the world and its transcendent view of that of the Messiah. But even here, the apocalyptics were conscious of their place in the light of the future hope, and to interpret their prophecies in terms of their new eschatological expectations. And so that's what we have the meaning today. So even when we look at our religious world, especially the Protestant religious world, we find that these people do not understand the coming of the kingdom, as the Bible points out to us. The apocalyptics believe in the life after death went far beyond anything to be found in the prophets, and was no doubt again influenced by the Persian thought. But even this belief was built upon the prophetic hope of restoration, and not for the nation only, in an earthly kingdom. Notice that earthly kingdom there, in an earthly kingdom. It wasn't an earthly kingdom, it was a spiritual kingdom, but for the individual also in a heavenly kingdom. And so the church is here upon the earth. If he were talking about that, but that's not what he's talking about. And so there is a family here upon the earth. There's the family of that of in heaven. So of a particular interest in this connection is the apocalyptic conception of the day of the final judgment, which may be described as a specification of the prophetic day of the Lord. We'll look at that. H. Wheeler Robson sees in his prophetic day four characteristics: judgment, universality, supernatural invention, and proximity. He says, in addition, he notes four features contained in it. It brings to the focus the manifestation of God's purpose in history. This day on which God acts, not merely speaks. It is a day on which God is shown to be victorious. For in this present world, and on the stage of human history, it is a day which ushers in a new era on the earth. Notice that, on the earth now, a new day on the earth. So everything he's talking about is that of a millennial type idea. And yet, but we do look back and we can see the history and all that's been taking place and brought us up to this point because of the eternal purpose of God. It is of interest, though, to observe that all these characteristics and features can be traced in reference to the interpretation of these apocalyptic people. They can trace it to the apocalyptic day of final judgment, but it's not correct. There are differences. It is true. No, if it's given by God, there would not be any differences, some of which may have been caused by foreign influence, but in the vast majority of cases, these differences appears as developed within the prophetic idea. And I notice he's going to give us an example. He says, for example, the emphasis came increasingly to be laid not so much on God's judgment within time and on the plane of history as on his judgment in a setting beyond time and above history. The idea of judgment was no longer confined to the living, but was extended to include the dead. Instead of taking the form of great crisis or great rise in history determined the fate of nations. The final judgment tended to assume a definitely forensic character in which individual men would be judged, influenced though they were then by ideas of the foreign to the Hebrew tradition. The apocalypse did not lose sight of the prophetic teachings concerning the future hope, but enlarged it and enriched it out of their own religion, insight, and experience. And that is a very important statement in reference to that because it's out of their own religious insight and experience. It wasn't what God had revealed in that of the Old Testament. You have to understand that. It's good sometimes, I guess, for us to read and try to study some of the books that because we don't have books written by members of the church, but to realize how that they put in all these different types of doctrines and that are erroneous. And sometimes some people come along and they'll read the book and that's what they come away with, but yet they don't go back and research and see what the Bible really has to say. In other words, when we deal with that of inspiration, which we're going to do. And so we will take our break, 15-minute break, 7:30. And we'll come back and talk about that and see how far we can get. We will go, we'll take a 15-minute break. And then if you have to, we're not going to take a 15-minute break at the end because that way we'll get 50 more minutes of what we lost last week. And we'll do that this week, next week, and final week. And we'll make up our, instead of saying a whole hour, then we'll do it that way. Because we'd have a break anyway. We'll go to 9 o'clock tonight. This, my voice does not allow me to do it. Okay, so let's take a break. Can you hear me?